or systems or alternatives to extremist networks, right? At times we're going to need people to be equally as dedicated and passionate as the extremists are. And I hope that a voice like mine can motivate people, not just other extremists or extremists now, but people in general, to realize that it's worth the risk. Because if you don't have skin in the game in something, then everything you say is going to come across as like, yep, that's hypocrisy. Like, that's not really practiced on the ground. It sounds good, but rhetoric and practice and policy have to match. So I try to embody that. In reality, you should differentiate, in my opinion, between radicalization and violent extremism. Radicalization is a cognitive and spiritual process. It does not involve behavior. The violent extremist track comes to when you support violence as a means of affecting social change due to a radical cognitive state of existence. This is basically the gist of what we do differently with regard to how we view CVE. My organization is called Parallel Networks. Parallel Network would take me a lot of time to go through it, but Albert Einstein said that you cannot address a problem at the same level of consciousness that created it. When 9/11 happened, we had a choice on how we were going to address a problem. We stood and had our president say that you were either with us or against the terrorists, which is a black and white worldview at the same level of consciousness that was created by Osama bin Laden. And Osama bin Laden sat on a hill somewhere with Qaiser Aluni from Al Jazeera a month later, after the global war on terror was announced, and he confirmed that President Bush said indeed the truth, but that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And then he said something very important, because it was a big piece of propaganda. This is where the ideology comes in. He quoted a verse in the Quran: anyone who imitates, he said, the Jews and the Christians are allies together, right? And if any one of you allies together with them against the Muslims, then verily you are not a Muslim. So he said, if anyone supports George Bush even with one word, they have exited Islam. And he gave the evidence for it. That became one of the primary teachings and ways that one established the doctrine of takfir and set forth a black and a white worldview coming out of the global war on terror that now has led to sustained wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and also it's come home to roost. So as a product of the war in Iraq, we have more salafis jihadists in the world today than at 9/11. But the real consequence is one internal. So when I was radicalizing, they were telling us to polarize the domestic landscape. The way we did that was we were the Muslims calling for Sharia. So the right wing said, the Muslims want to take over. It was great for their xenophobic, anti-immigrant views. And it became part of the narrative that now is on the far right. And now today, in reaction, so 8 years of Obama, people suffering in the world changing. Why? Because of an inability to conduct economic policy in a way that was productive as a response to 9/11 too, which is very complex. But basically the global recession, 2007, 2008, leads to a very changing demographic, and 8 years of Obama, who happens to be the African-American president, helps to fuel this sort of post-crisis situation in working-class white America that makes for the election of Donald Trump. And now the election of Donald Trump has led to a lot of radicalization on the left. What we don't like to realize is because we're responding to the threat at the same level of consciousness that created it. So we're getting further polarized. And in polarized milieus, radicalization increases on both lenses. The indoctrination and the ability to otherize and to dehumanize increases, and by its very nature, simple mathematics, there'll be more violent extremism as a result of polarization at the root core. That's domestic. So now it's no longer in making the US wage wars overseas, it's about proving that democracies malfunction from within because they are hypocritical. So you point to the human rights abuses, you point to the hypocritical practices as they're framed by jihadists, which is not accurate. but there are grays in between. It suggests that neither side is absolutely correct in the way they're portrayed. And that's what a parallel network is. So a parallel network says if we contribute to this polarization, we should be principle-based. And that if we're going to address the problem, which is polarization at its core, globally, clash of civilizations, domestically, now in the United States, far right, far left, right, then we have to address it at a level of higher consciousness. And so we do a lot of programming around this to change the narratives, right, about this, because that requires a very different perception and a very different way of analyzing what you're promoting with regard to an alternative message as well. But that parallel network that you formulate, we don't think, another thing is, if I create a network that's built on antithetical principles to hate and extremism, it has to be a network. And if it's an extremist network, it has to function in similar ways. It has to have a brand, it has to have activity, it has to have a cause, it has to have ultimately the ability to give the same sense of meaning, significance, and purpose to non-violent activists and to hubs in a new network that extremists offer their advice. It's harder because violence can be more appealing than passive presentations, but if we present the lives of people like Gandhi or in a proper way, that's equally evocative, it's equally powerful. We have to understand better about counter-messaging that people are not rational, they behave on emotion, and then you can bring the rationality into it. But most importantly, we can't think about trying to affect the life of an individual and taking them out, unless I can tell you where you should go from here. So like, not to be too complex, I give one concrete example. We did a recent study on the people that are coming home in the United States with terrorism-related offenders using our philosophy of parallel networks. We looked at what other countries are doing. They might provide economic support, they might provide educational support, but they're thinking about the individual. They're not thinking about the context in which the individual is going to return to. And then you're lacking an ability to understand that rather than just have a de-radicalization initiative or program, you should have that connected to a broader, more robust approach at countering the underlying causality of the extremism, meaning your prevent programming, right? Former extremists like me are some of your most credible voices in the realm of prevention. So using this seems like you're addressing an individual, but creating a network that individual, if he does de-radicalize, can become involved in and experience the same sense of meaning, significance, and importance is equally important. So it's not about the individuals that are on the fringe, it's about creating communities. And if we're going to combat, so we use counter messaging, you counter something, I don't know, you only counter something if it needs to be countered, and if you make it seem like it's a threat, that's exactly what terrorists want you to do. But if you don't realize that only networks can combat networks, right, then you have a problem, because you're going to insert one piece of information into extremist network, it's going to get one drowned out by the noise. And even if it does pluck somebody who's on the edges out, they're going to use that counter-propaganda to radicalize 10 more, because it's like a hydra. If you cut the leg off, it grows back. You got to get to the hub. That's how networks are disintegrated. And so to answer your question, no, I can't. I have to create, I didn't have a network of social support with people like me, so I had to create one. Now I have a former neo-Nazi female who was raped and became a neo-Nazi. I have white supremacist. I just added a guy that was former member of the KKK. I work with a guy who actually joined Al-Qaeda. Yesterday we got contacted by someone in the Netherlands who's now wants to be a former extremist. And so we put together a cadre of formers that supports each other, right? And then and then by not just supporting each other, but by letting that become the cornerstone of a movement and unleashing that to the public, other people can get inspired to get the same sense of meaning and significance and purpose to extremists offer. And that's a really important way of thinking about this multidimensionally and holistically. People do prevent, people do intervention, people do counter-messaging, people do rehabilitation and reintegration. They should all be interconnected. You have to take an ecosystemic approach, is what we say. Whether or not we're correct or not is another thing. And there's other steps along these lines, but putting it all together and having the right creativity. Like, we build our programming on 3 principles that are antithetical to hate. One is the promotion of a global democratic identity. That we all live in a world of nation states, but because we are living in an age of interconnectivity, we can easily identify or formulate an identity that does not have any nationalist tendency at all. Therefore, what should be promoted is that you're an American, you're a Nigerian, you're a Moroccan, you're a Spaniard, but you're part of a global community that is witnessing a time when what we do now today, a generation from today, will manifest itself as the world we live in tomorrow. It could be equally authoritarian as it was 50 years ago, right? Or it could be taking progress and growth if we can let the trauma we're experiencing now globally lead us to come to a point where we say, okay, let's do something, because you could predict, something could happen tomorrow and spark World War III. That sounds crazy, but it's the truth. It's time to act. So global democratic identity is a higher level of consciousness. Nation states are important, but we're all interconnected by Facebook, by social media, by tech companies basically control what is free speech, right? But at the same time, when you map our communication on these platforms, no engagement in between on any issue. So the global democratic identity, you call it. The second one is creative pacifism. That art and creativity is not only the true thing that allows us to develop culture and separate ourselves sort of from the beast, which is kind of, that requires more nuance. But it's also art and creativity that are the most effective route towards sustainable change in a society or a situation. And that it is creativity that can induce the same sort of activity in the brain that watching a violent movie or watching the propaganda of ISIS can induce. The same dopamine chemical, the same neurotransmitters associated with arousal, art and creative expression can give you the same. And then you combine that with the fact that the grievances of extremists are not always true, but at least parts of them are true. And the way they justify it in their head is if they're only acting to address the grievance. So to present an alternative pathway through creative expression, which the fundamentalist mind does not like creativity. I was liberated to study Islam in a cell after being told that you couldn't think for yourself in Islam because you had to take knowledge at the feet of the scholar. And by extracting that creativity, I was always a creative person. By taking that creativity away from me and reducing me to memorization, I desensitized myself to violence. Wherever there's creativity and wherever there's artistic, enlightened understandings as a consequence of paying attention to art and creativity, there's resilience in that space. So creative pacifism is the idea that art and creativity are a better means and can be marketed in the same way, or can build a network that offers that sense of meaning, significance, and importance, which is also expression, right? One can blow themselves up and make a statement, like Mohammed Bouazizi, who started the Arab Spring. He burned himself. Not much different state of mind than a suicide bomber, but he's a hero in that context, right? Because it was for a greater good, so to say, right? And it was not, he didn't hurt anybody else other than himself, but it's sort of the same act. So you can experience the same purpose, same meaning, same significance through that, which could be considered, as horrendous as it sounds, it was a creative act. Immolation is meant to make a statement. It's a statement of art, like someone going and standing in the middle of a park and freezing still. It's meant, look at me, I'm doing this for a reason, feel this, right? That's creative pacifism. We don't want people burning themselves, but we want to tap into that ability. For the story of Osama bin Laden can be very appealing to a recruit, but Martin Luther King's story could be equally as appealing. You know, motivating people in different nonviolent directions is something that you can see what creativity that leads to meditation does in the state of the one that needs trauma treatment. Trauma treatment will be counter-effectual until you get into a state of meditation, and now we can put, you know, measures on our minds to see that whether you're a monk, whether you're a Buddhist, whether you're a priest, whether you're an imam, whether you're a whatever religion you practice, when you enter into a state of prayer, everyone experiences a similar state of mindlessness that will open them up to communication of a higher order. So creating spaces where that's possible is part of creative pacifism and thinking along those lines. Enlightened humanism is a critique on, basically, it's a call for something that Thomas Kuhn, who was a scientist who wrote a book called on scientific revolution, and he used a term called paradigm shift, where like you have people think that the universe revolves around the Earth, and then all of a sudden all of the simplistic mathematical computations, all of the theories of existence, all of this revolve around this centered strategy, and then Copernicus comes and puts and some say Galileo, comes and puts the sun in the middle of the system, and he calls it a paradigm shift in science. And this is what occurs when the old way of thinking and doing and studying and analyzing no longer works. And right now, what we're learning about is that what we've been doing in a reductionist, behavioralist-driven school of empiricism, like the way we study stuff, ivory tower type studies, sometimes in a laboratory, sometimes in the field with case studies and qualitative analysis, it's still skewed because we're applying an understanding of human beings that assumes that on the aggregate they're rational, for example. So like economic theory is based upon rational actor, and so is a lot of counterterrorism theory, right? But rational actor has been disproven. And it was disproven by a non-economist who was a psychologist named Daniel Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize in economics, having never taken an economics class in his life, because he looked at the irrationality of decision-making. And human beings don't look at facts, and they don't do what's best for them. And they value things that are personal way more than they value things in a rationally market. And it has applications to the appeal of ideology, but we haven't changed the thinking. We're on the threshold of something huge with the development of what we can see now with brain science. Every day, network science, neuroscience, we reveal these things that mean the entire, what we're starting to realize now, and maybe I didn't realize yet, is we have a book here in the West called the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Psychologists for diagnosing depression, bipolar, all these issues. We're now learning that it's all just simply symptoms of trauma. We're now learning that PTSD, what we study as trauma, is a particular event. We don't have anything in this book that talks about prolonged trauma experienced repeatedly over life, typically from the state of childhood, adverse childhood experience as a diagnosis, because addiction, mental health are all symptoms of trauma. And then when we're looking at how we're treating trauma, we're learning about meditation, we're learning about nutrition, we're learning about the holistic nature of treatment of trauma means that cognitive behavioral tools, giving people information so that they can change their way of thinking, or teaching them how to count to 10 when they get angry, to suppress what's natural and not give them a way to get right to the root of it. It's the reason substance abuse counseling based upon old measurable outcome ways of thinking doesn't work, but AA does. So there's like a 4% chance after 2 years of going through outpatient substance abuse treatment, you'll still be sober. But participation in NA is almost, or A, which is a 12-step program that just run in church basements here in the United States, is 4 times greater likelihood of success in 2-year follow-up, because it talks about spirituality. So we're learning more and more about the spiritual dimension and more about what we don't know, right? And we went through a period where we were really on the threshold of like the mechanization of social sciences, treating social sciences as if they were natural sciences. And I know that that's like a whole nother discussion, but what we're learning is that the old way of thinking doesn't work. And so that's what enlightened humanism is humanism is based upon the idea that you don't study things from afar and then learn how to fix the problem and then develop programming around it. It's that the other way of thinking allows you to measure stuff. So you try through tinkering, trial and error, and in the process of trying, you measure results and learn how to measure results because you have a baseline to compare and to contrast. Right now, what happens is you go in, you interview 30 people on the ground, typically former extremists who all, because for different reasons, might not give a particular accurate interpretation of their past just from what we know in psychology. And so basically the idea is to turn it around on its head, because if you got to tinker before you can study, then the people that lead the tinkering have to be the people on the ground. And that's a very different way of thinking about things, right? And the peace building community knows it, because they're constantly stressing the importance of creating influencers, but then some create dependencies between the organization and the influencer, and others try to allow that person to be completely free and give the skills to continue to sustain going forward. And it's a very hard dynamic to get into, but if we tap into that realm, that's where we think enlightened humanism is essentially, when you synthesize those three principles, a gateway into a higher order of consciousness.